Welcome to Blackwater Media's Creature Feature Anthology 2, a collection of bizarre and frightening encounter stories, some cryptid and some purely supernatural, but all terrifying. So sit back and enjoy. And when you get ready to go to sleep, don't forget to check under the bed and in the closet. And by all means, don't turn out the light. I had a very creepy experience on my way to work one morning. Now listen, I normally don't give much thought to anything paranormal, but I'll be damned if that thing I saw could be explained rationally. On my way to work, I often use a small road through a densely wooded area. It's a pretty long road, very few curves, no turns. I left home around 4:30 a.m. and was driving, paying attention to the road, trying to wake up, when I suddenly noticed what I thought was a very large, dark gray or black dog sitting next to the road. Now keep in mind, it was still dark, but I could make it out in full detail, so I slowed down, just in case it started to run across the road. But when I got closer, and the headlights captured it in full, it just stood up and calmly retreated into the bushes next to the road. But as soon as it stood up, it was very clear that this was no normal dog. I mean, it was fucking huge. A bear size at least, or even bigger, I'd say. It had shorter hind legs, muscular front, and a weirdly long snout and pointy ears, and a bushy tail. And it kind of walked almost like a hyena, but always on all fours. Now, big predators are very rare in this area, and if there is a sighting about every 2 years or so, it's usually a lone wolf, or very rarely, a bear wandering through. Something else. This stretch of road has always given me the creeps, but now the fear has a face. One thing I noticed the last few days was that there were no other animals around. Now, normally there are always some deer, some foxes, or if I get lucky, even a badger. But that week, nothing, not even a bird. There had also been some reports of missing livestock in the area, and this was disturbing. 2 sheep went missing the week before, and a few days ago, a horse was lost. It was later found, brutally ripped apart and partially eaten. Now, I can't swear that this unknown canine creature was responsible for this, but I highly suspect that it is. My name is Terry, and I have a short but scary story about my run-in with a dog man. I live in a certain part of Florida that has very deep woods and it's a very swampy location. I don't want to be too specific about the names of places. In fact, I've even changed some of the names for the purposes of this story, because I've learned all too well what can happen when people find out about a dog man encounter. Now, I've had multiple strange occurrences around my property, mostly at night. But I want to tell you about this one particular incident that, to put it mildly, scared the hell out of me. Now, what happened took place in an area called Gibson Creek Campground. I was invited to go hunting with a buddy of mine last winter for wild hogs. You could usually find them out there looking for water or rutting around in the muck. So we left out from Gibson Creek Campground and paddled upstream. Eventually, we made it way out to where we could make another camp. After nightfall, we'd already set out a couple of trail cameras. I'd say we were there till about 2 a.m. And the forest, which is usually quite noisy, was somehow strangely silent. You know, that kind of quiet that you know isn't right? So I turned to my buddy and he turned to me. We gave each other those looks of a little fear and a little confusion. So we humped it back to the tent. I'd say no more than 60 seconds later, we heard what sounded like something huge booking it across the creek over on our side about 10 feet out, and then it just stopped. When we looked out, oh my God, what we saw was a gigantic wolf, maybe 8 feet tall, standing there on the other side of the creek. I heard a deep, low-level growl, and my friend perked up to silently announce that he heard it too. So of course, you can imagine that seeing that creature, realizing that something like that is real, scared the complete and total shit out of both of us. We didn't hear it anymore, and after that, the regular nighttime forest sounds came back. Crickets, owls, all of the things you'd expect. But we didn't leave our tent until daylight. So please, allow me to offer this little advice. If you enjoy camping, that's fine. If you enjoy a jaunt through the woods, great. But when the sun starts to go down, get your ass out of the forest and back to the main camping area and stay there until sunrise. I'm an avid bird watcher. I took up the hobby about 3 years ago, and it's really been one of the most enjoying, fulfilling experiences of my life. I remember when I was little, my grandmother had several bird feeders and baths in her backyard, and I would sit at the window and watch all the different birds fly in and out. Robins, brown thrashers, cardinals, blue jays, as well as many more that I couldn't identify at the time. But it was my love of bird watching, or some people are now calling it birding, that led to an experience that I would never, ever forget. It was about this time last year on an unusually warm January day when I trekked up to Dawson Forest Wildlife Management Area. Dawsonville is north of Atlanta in Dawson County. The location is a large area of varied habitat near the Etowah River. I knew that the marshy wetlands hosted breeding species including common yellowthroat, indigo bunting, blue grosbeak, orchard oriole, so on and so forth. Plus, I was counting on seeing what species could be seen along the edges of the forest. There was a nice blind with a bench overlooking the pond where I could look for waterfowl and waders. So that's exactly where I headed once I got there. I hit the bench, took out my thermos of piping hot coffee, poured a cup, took a few sips, and just kind of took in the surroundings. The morning mist had all but dissipated. I broke out my Athlon Argos binoculars, looked out across the pond, and got the shock of my life. Standing on the far bank of the pond was some kind of large canine-type creature. It reminded me of something in many of the werewolf movies over the last several years. Its ears pointed straight up. It was very tall and had broad, powerful-looking shoulders. Through my binoculars, I could make out its muscle definition, and its eyes had a very deep orange tint to them. The other really strange thing about it was that it seemed to have hands with fingers instead of paws. I was in an absolute vortex of abject fear and wild fascination. Now the creature looked around and then went down on all fours and started drinking, but stopped after only a few seconds. It raised up its nose and I could see its nostrils flaring. Then came a moment of total terror. It must have caught my scent because it locked its eyes dead on me. And I didn't move. But while I kept my binoculars on the creature, my brain was on fire trying to calculate how fast I could get back to the car. Then, as it kept those enormous fiery eyes fixed on me, the creature let out a roar that hit me like a tornado. From that point on, I was in survival instinct mode, and I'm sure that I moved faster that day than I ever had in my life. Shit, I'm not even sure that my feet were touching the ground, and before I knew it, I was slamming the car door shut and starting the engine. I don't even think I exhaled until I hit the on-ramp to the interstate. So that's what happened. I have read a good bit on cryptozoology since then. All kinds of encounters with all kinds of creatures. Chupacabra, Mothman, Bigfoot, lake monsters, and a menagerie of other weird things. And of all things, my first and so far only cryptid experience had to be with a damn dog man. Maybe the very worst of all. Now, I'm a First Nations person from a reservation in Canada. I grew up in different reserves with different family members. We all have a common belief. If something otherworldly is bothering you, then someone is inviting it in. We believe that these negative powers are always seeking a way to influence people. Anyhow, this happened when I was about 7 years old. My sister and I were visiting our grandparents' house. The adults decided to go to bingo, and they got the eldest cousin to babysit everyone. His name was Corey, who was at the time 16. Now, my grandparents' home has a few trees around the property that they planted, and outside of that is a mile of straight field that they use for farming. We were outside all day there. My cousin Corey was sitting on the patio as we were all jumping on the trampoline, and he was watching us. I went inside, and when I came back out, I jumped up on the edge of the patio to jump off onto the trampoline. My sister, who was 5 at the time, and my other cousin, who was also 5, were already on the trampoline, and they stood in my way. Now, I kept telling them to move, and as I was about to jump, I noticed that they were completely fixated on the field. So I looked towards the field too. There were 2 strange figures coming towards our location. The field is about a mile long, like I said, but you could see 2 huge black things kind of hopping, coming down the field. They would come up and then down, like a snake taking a peek, and their movement was in perfect unison. I called out to Corey and pointed towards the field, and he told us all to get inside the house and lock up because he didn't know what the hell they were. So we did as we were told. I don't remember much after going in, but it was like I just came out of a trance and started crying. My sister was beside me crying, and my other cousin Charlene, who was about 11 at that time, was also crying, holding my little cousin Cass. I got up to go to the front door, and Corey was running back in. He said those things were circling the house, and he was trying to run across the road to the neighbors. Now, for whatever reason, the phone had just stopped working, and it was just a bunch of kids in a house. I went back to the couch to sit with my sister so we could comfort each other. When I got to her, she told me to look at the window, so I did. And those things were looking in. They had their hands against the window as they peeked in. Now here's the crazy shit. They looked like crocodiles, but also strangely human. I mean, they didn't have the extended snout of a crocodile. They had 5 fingers, but they weren't human fingers. They had long nails with crocodile-like skin and walked standing upright. They had like this long black cloak or something on. So they stood at the window for only a few seconds and took off. Now, soon after that, our grandparents got home with my uncle. We all went running to them crying, telling them what had happened. My grandparents were very traditional and told us that they had to leave and needed us to go to my aunt's on another reserve. My aunt came to get us not long later, and my uncle was upset. He drove all around that field looking for whatever those things were. But when we jumped into my aunt's old van to go to her house, we saw those things behind our grandparents' house running south. You know, at one point, I tried to convince myself that the whole damn experience was just a dream. But I was just bullshitting myself. Over the years, I would bring it up at family gatherings, and everyone who was there at the time would recall the events of that terrifying night. I've been hunting for over 30 years now. My father, grandfather, great uncle, and cousins all taught me the meaning of the ways of the hunter. And not just that, I learned what it meant to be an outdoorsman, to have an understanding, an appreciation, and respect for nature. But none of that experience, none of that understanding or appreciation could have prepared me for an encounter with a dog man. All of it came about one morning with me and my father scouting out a new hunting area. Since we were totally unfamiliar with the area, we thought it prudent to not go unarmed. About 20 minutes in, we found a trail that needed checking out. As soon as we hit it, I caught a flash of movement off to the left side of the trail, about 25 to 30 yards away. I didn't think much of it at first because it's normal, for example, to see the movement of birds flitting back and forth on branches and into the brush and brambles of a thicket. But both my dad and I stopped cold in our tracks when the sound of a low rumbling growl reached our ears. But it was more than that. You could feel the power of the growl vibrating all the way through you down to the bone. Now, I said quietly that we must have walked up on a bear with a cub and the growl was intended to scare us off. But my father just shook his head and said, "We have a situation here." Then the shit got real. From the left side of the trail, out of the brush, stepped a gigantic wolf-like creature that was standing on 2 legs. The head was easily 3 times bigger than a large German shepherd. It had black fur and dirty yellow eyes. And this thing had a muscle mass like you wouldn't fucking believe. It was easily 7 feet tall and had a mouthful of teeth that looked ready to do business. So there we were, my father and I, caught up in a terrifying showdown with this thing. I raised my pistol and pointed it at the creature, and when I did, it tilted its head to the right. Then my dad said under his breath, "Put that goddamn thing down and take 2 steps back." Then the creature dropped down on all 4 legs and took off to the right at a tremendous speed, and we watched it until it disappeared into the forest. That was about 10 years ago. My father and I have talked about it several times, only with each other, off and on since then. He always reminds me that if I'd pulled the trigger that day, that I probably wouldn't be around today to share this story with you. Okay, so I have a story about a creepy encounter that my friends and I had. To set the scene, we were on a Boy Scout camping shooting trip. There were between 20 and 30 of us. We were in a small cabin with windows on the front and back, and a front and back door. There were wooden tables all around the area. The adult cabin, with the bathroom, was about 1/8 of a mile down a gravel road in the dark. Now, it was the Boy Scout, so there was obviously a buddy system. Now, at around midnight, everyone had been telling scary stories, like normal camping trips. Well, I had to go to the bathroom, and I asked my friend to come along. He said, sure. And we got our knives. We knew that there were bears in the woods, and it made us feel safer. Well, we went to the bathroom and started our walk back. That's when it got scary. I mean, shit scary. I felt an instinctive sense of fear. I looked at my friend, and he had the same look on his face. So we started to walk a little faster and also unfolded our pocket knives. I turned around, and I saw it. Now, this thing looked similar to a cat, but it was at least 6 feet tall and on its hind legs, kind of hunched over. I freaked the fuck out and started running like you wouldn't believe. My friend saw it too, and we sprinted back to the cabin. The creature began making a moaning, howling noise, somewhere in between those two, and it followed us slowly. We pounded on the door, and the guys let us in. We told them what we saw, and they actually believed us. So we locked the front door and looked at the back door. It didn't have a lock. So we pushed the table up against it and had another friend stay there with his knife for safety. We drew the blinds on all the windows, although one of them didn't have blinds, and we sat there with all the lights on. Of course, we saw the eyes outside of the windows without blinds. To put it bluntly, we were all scared shitless. And this thing walked slowly to the back door. We heard this damn thing bumping up against the door, maybe trying to open it. Then, it just left. But we still thought that we were going to die. Nobody slept. When the adults came to wake us up, we told them, and they just laughed and said we were making it up. We know what happened, even if they don't believe us. That's the sound that I hear almost nightly for weeks at a time, beginning in September, or more precisely, immediately after the advent of the fall equinox. I live about an hour and a half's drive north of a major city in the southeastern United States. In this particular area, you can find sizable stretches of woodlands, creeks, and even some relatively dense forests. This is the habitat of those things out there. Those creatures howling into the darkness of the autumn night sky. This past autumn, the fall of 2020, was no different. I heard the howls in the distance and listened as they seemed to come closer. This seemed to be their nightly routine, to emerge from the inner depths of the forest and prowl along its outer perimeter. I know because it got to the point where I could go out on my deck, which overlooks a wood line, and I could actually watch them step out of the woodland cover. There would typically be 4 or 5 of them, never less than 3, at least of what I could see. On nights with good moonlight, I could see them even better. They would move through the trees, going from 4 legs to 2, and then back again seemingly arbitrarily. When they did go bipedal, I got a true sense of their size and features. But it was always the eyes. Now, one could easily be struck by the 7 or 8 foot height, the clawed fingered hands, the impressive musculature, or even the surreal nature of their movement. But for me, it was the eyes. Those massive, amber, nightmarish hell portals through which somehow these creatures measured their reality. There were even rare occasions when one of them would turn those eyes in my direction, looking directly at me, as if to let me know that they were aware of my presence, and then turned its gaze away dismissively and walked on. Their eyes terrified me. So yes, these things are out there, hunting, lurking, hiding, stalking. And I know that come September next, there will once again be howls in the forest. In 2016, I was visiting some relatives in Maryland. Every so often I'd stop by and just relax with them. Where they live was somewhat suburban with forest land towards the back of their property. It was a fairly large wooded area, but I never really paid much attention to it. I said all that to give a picture of my surroundings on this particular night. It had to be between 11:30 and midnight. Anyway, we were talking when a strange feeling came over me, as though something bad was about to happen. I got up off the porch and began to scan the street. My cousins all the while talking, when I saw a creature that resembled a deer walk out onto the street. It was 4-legged with way more muscle mass than any buck I ever seen. Its head was huge and fit its massive body. Height-wise, I'd say it was about 6.5 feet, maybe more. Its antlers were the strangest part to me, though. I mean, they were wide, way more so than I thought they should be. But they didn't really stick up like a regular deer. They curved and bent into 3 intricately grown stacks on top of each other. It was weird. It gave me the impression that it was some ancient beast that roamed the woods for hundreds of years. It was like this thing shouldn't even have existed. It didn't even have that timid, skittish walk like you see from most deer. It walked as though it was royalty and dared anyone to challenge it. It stopped in the middle of the street and just stared at me. So we both stood looking at each other for about 20 seconds or so. And it was as if it wanted me to know that it was there. Then, just as calm as it walked out, it turned and walked back to the direction it came. Now, of course, my cousins were too busy running their mouths to get off the porch and see it. So I'm the only one that got a good look at it. And when I tried to tell one of them, their drunk asses just said it was an old buck. Now, I'm by no means an outdoors man, but I've seen older bucks with gray hairs and huge antlers, and that thing was nothing like them. When I told an old coworker of mine from South America who's had encounters with the paranormal, she told me that the devil had decided to show himself to me that night. So that's my whole story from that night. I shared it because, in all honesty, I wish I knew what the hell that thing was. And hopefully, it wasn't the devil. But the way that year was for me, it might well have been. My family on my dad's side moved from Delaware to South Carolina in the 70s. They came through the state of Maryland on the way down. My dad and his brother were behind a good ways in another car, and it was late at night. There were no cars on the road, no houses, no nothing, just miles of road. Now keep in mind that this was in the 70s. That means no cell phones, no OnStar, no GPS. None of the things that make highway travel much easier nowadays. Back then, when you were traveling down an isolated highway, there were all kinds of things that could go wrong with no hope of help or assistance. To coin a phrase, it was a different time. Anyway, as they cruised down the highway, they came upon an old woman with an odd-looking dress on, walking down the side of the road. So, they started to slow down and noticed that she was very pale. It was strange. It was damn strange. At that point, they were starting to get some really, really bad vibes. Well, as they pulled up next to her, my dad, who was in the passenger seat, said, "Miss, do you need some help?" Now later on, he said that when she turned her head, she looked like something out of the movie The Exorcist. Her pale face was ghastly, and her eyes looked completely black. And worst of all, she made what sounded like a terrible hissing reptilian sound, which, as you might imagine, scared everybody 10 kinds of shitless. My uncle floored it, and he kept that car at around 90 to 100 miles per hour till they were out of Maryland. It's a miracle that there wasn't an accident, or that they weren't stopped by the police. My uncle won't talk about it, but my dad told me the whole story. There's some seriously weird shit in Maryland. This is my first time going public about my dogman encounter, mostly out of fear of seeing it again. This took place roughly 14 years ago. When I was a kid, my family moved out of the city and moved to a small town called Deer Brook, situated on the outskirts of Antigua, Wisconsin. Our house was surrounded by woods on 3 sides and a river and field in the back. The first year out there was really calm and relaxing, other than constant coyote howls every night. But every so often there would be a different howl. It was a deeper, much louder howl that would shake us to our core. At first, my parents would dismiss it as a wolf or just a bigger coyote, but something about it seemed off. One night in mid-July, my brother, my sister, and I decided to pitch a tent in the back field along the tree line. We just wanted to go camping. We sat with sticks, roasting our marshmallows by the fire till it got really dark, and then the typical howl started up. But once again, that deep howl was back, and it sounded like it was right in our ears. With how loud it was, it's hard to even guess where it was coming from, so we decided to put out the fire and get in the tent. Later that night, my sister fell asleep, so my brother and I chatted and just made jokes. Within minutes, we heard animals running around outside the tent. And then this little raccoon started to claw at the side of the tent that I was sleeping on. At first, I just kept poking at it, But then we heard something else. The crack of sticks from the trees. At that point, my brother thought it was a bear and told us to be quiet and woke up my sister. We started to hear footsteps coming closer and closer, and pretty quickly, they were right next to me. Now the raccoon just bolted the hell out of there. And then there was this strange odor coming from somewhere, and it smelled like copper, sulfur, and a wet dog. It was almost overpowering and made me feel like I could throw up. Then we heard our mom calling us, and as she shined the flashlight on us, it revealed the most unsettling thing I've ever seen. The shadow of this thing was shining through our tent, and it was massive. It had pointed ears that were tilted back like a dog on the prowl, and its hands were human-looking with long fingers that ended in a point. The mouth was in the shape of a snout, just a little shorter, and it had a mid-sized tail. My mom started screaming, and whatever the thing was bolted back into the woods, and that's when I got a fairly good look at it. We tore ass inside the house with our mom and didn't go back out for a few days. Now fast forward a few months. I was in the living room with my mom while my sister was in the shower. We were watching Wheel of Fortune or some game show like that when my sister screamed, "Bloody murder." My mom jumped up and went to get her. She pulled her out of the bathroom, and I got curious as to why she was freaking out, so I went in to see. Above the shower is one of those super small windows that only a small head could fit through. And in the window was a set of red, glowing eyes staring down at me. Holy shit. We stared at each other for what seemed like a decade, even though it could only have been a few seconds. Now here's the weird thing. I didn't feel fear, but more like curiosity. And I didn't feel like I was in any danger at that time. And as my mom came in to get me out, the eyes turned away as well. Now that night was a kind of gloomy night. It wasn't very windy, but there was a light drizzle. Later during the night, my brother and I got woken up to the window being opened. It was locked beforehand, by the way. After that, we just closed it and went back to bed. It happened again and again, like 3 more times, and each time we locked it. But the final time was the worst. It flung open so hard that the glass shattered, and then we saw the thing that pushed it open. It was that same monstrous hand from the tent, but I could see it clearly now. It had matted black fur, or hair rather, covering its whole arm. The skin on its palms was like a light tan, and the claws were easily 5 to 6 inches long. And on the bottom of the window, I saw its face, or what was showing of it. It was just the eyes, glowing bright red again, looking like the embers of a roaring fire. My brother and I bolted up, grabbed my sister, and locked ourselves in the back gaming room. We stayed there for the rest of the night. That's when my mom came home. We told her and packed our things. We moved out of that house in a day and took what we could fit, filling 1 car and a U-Haul trailer. My stepdad's truck was full as well, and we left never to return. To this day, my family is scared to talk about it, but if my brother and I have a few drinks, we discuss it. But my mom, she just shuts down whenever it's brought up.